Good morning, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be speaking with you this morning. I don't have a presentation. I am here and really looking to you to help frame the conversation that we'll have over the next half hour. Those of you in the audience who've been eagerly anticipating this conference might have been tracking the agenda as it evolved over the last few months and noticed this was a panel discussion and has now become a one-woman show. So I am now looking to you to help bring your insight, experience, expertise, and thoughtfulness to how we consider this question, which is increasingly existential for our sector. How do we understand the foundational elements and aspects of trust? How do we more proactively build it to address what some people are describing as an existential gap between societal expectations of this sector and our ability to demonstrate that we have heard, understood them, and are delivering against them, and to build what some people call a social contract or a social license to operate. So I wanted to start by getting a sense from you in the room of what those concepts mean to you. What does social license to operate mean? So I want you to just think about that, and there are roving mics, and I'd like you to bring into the room what you understand that to be. But first, I'd just like you to raise your hand and give me a sense of where you think social license to operate sits in terms of being integral and core to business success in the mining sector. So over here we've got 1, which is it's interesting, there's a lot of chat around it, but it's pretty peripheral on a scale of 1 to 10. 5 is, we're thinking about it, we know it's important, and we've got pretty clear arguments around why the social license is important, and then 10, where you see it as absolutely critical, and if you didn't secure it, the business would fold across the mining sector. So just a show of hands, who feels that in terms of the centrality of a social license to operate, it's really not that important? A lot of rhetoric, not a lot of teeth to it. It's important, we're thinking about it, but it doesn't stop the wheels of the bus, and it's absolutely critical. So can I ask people, who feels we're at 1? Okay. Who thinks kind of social license is important, but not really business critical? Be brave. There's no judgment. It's dark. No one else can really see you. I've had 1 person put their hand up. And who thinks it's really critical? Okay, so I'm preaching to the converted.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting how you phrased the question, which changes my answer. Are you asking, is your question where does it sit, or is your question where should it sit? Because I think those are 2 different things today.
So I'd like those of you who had your hand up, saying it's at 10. If you answered because you feel it should sit there, keep your hand up. And if you feel it actually does sit there in terms of how business decisions are made. So I'd say quite a lot of hands went down there. Quite a lot of hands went down. So what I'd now like you to do, having planted the seed in your mind, is what do you understand social license to be? What are the words you put around it? And if you could also just say where you're coming from. So are you a operational company person? Are you strategic? Are you an investor, a service provider? What does social license to operate mean?
Since I'm not very humble, I'll just start off. I'm from Norway, and we probably have a good example. The north of Norway, there's a mine that a friend of ours has tried to start for a while, a copper mine. She's been trying to get a license for 17 years just because of social license to operate. Even if this tailings plan is a good plan, it doesn't sit very well with the public, and therefore it doesn't sit well with politicians, and it's very hard to get his mine started and get it financed. Because of tailings, obviously, are a problem in the industry.
Yeah.
And I guess that seems to be the same all over Europe. When you want to start something new, it doesn't sit well with the environmental part of the population. Yet, the same part of the population require these metals and minerals for their green shift.
Yeah.
So, that's why this social license to operate is essential. And we in Ravel believe that technology is the key to answer that. And for those who like, can pop around our booth and have a discussion around that and how to solve that. But we see on a day-to-day basis it's very hard to get social license to operate, and therefore you can't get your approval.
Interesting. So social license being critical to the permitting process, particularly in the European context. Other suggestions of what social license is? This is about a project development, operationally related framing of it. In the back there, the lady, thank you.
Just in my experience, if you haven't got the community on board for a project, it doesn't work very well at all. In fact, the understanding can be quite turned over, and there's a case in the UK at the moment where a mining company was going ahead with things. There's been a lot of uproar with the community, and now the balance has been shifted altogether, and they didn't have the social license to operate. So it was very critical that they got that, but unfortunately they didn't.
And when you say it doesn't work very well, what does that look like?
Well, I'm not going to declare who it is, but I always think being open and honest from the very, very start, and including the community, all sectors of the community, is very, very important to getting your social license to operate.
Okay, super. Super. So it's about community relations, and not necessarily potentially in a permitting phrase, but that ongoing smooth operation of the site. Any other thoughts on what we mean by social license? So far, we're really focused on the asset level. Yeah.
I suppose the way I think about this is you're trying to align interests with key stakeholders, and there's kind of a societal value proposition that you have to get them to buy into, and trust that you're not just saying the right things at the beginning, but it's kind of a commitment that people can trust and buy into over the long term.
Okay, super. Trust. Great. Another couple. A lady here.
I think there's two issues here. On the one hand, if we simply listen to every single person who objected to a project, then no mining then every single mining project in the world would stop. And on the other hand, there is the issue that the mining company, exploration company, needs to be involved in education of the local population.
About mining?
About dissuading, not dissuading, about explaining that many of the fears that they have may be unfounded, and explaining how they're unfounded. But on the other hand, they are quite right in saying that some of the fears that they may have are founded. I mean, you know, we have sort of situations, for example, of tailings dams that fail, and cyanide going down rivers and killing fish and everything. But on the other hand, the fact that cyanide, that people don't seem to understand very often, that cyanide quickly breaks down, and therefore that it is a short-term issue.
Okay.
The one against the other.
Great. Okay. Super. I'm just going to take just a couple more. So there was a lady here, just a couple of rows forward, and then a gentleman over here. So this sense that social license is about a process, it's kind of an obligation, but how do you decide? Who do you listen to? Who is granting the social license? Here we had it was a regulatory body, and there we had it's which community members, who has voice, how do you make those decisions, and on what basis are they making those assessments on their own? It's kind of what do we mean by social license? And another set of reflections.
Great. I'm from Dubuis Group, part of the Anglo-American group, so from a producer's side. And I'd just like to not obviously not echoing all that's been said, but just introduce the notion that social license to operate is not just a once-off, we have it to then go ahead with the project, but just continue this notion of a continuation. And the fact that it's something that you know you don't have it, but sometimes it's not clear when you really have it. So really about this continuation and always having your finger on the pulse, because it's so dynamic and complex, the nuances that exist in really trying to manage those conflicting interests with your key stakeholders.
So that's fascinating. So this idea of social license as a kind of regulatory stage, it bites in at regulatory permitting stages, but actually you know when you've lost it, but it's a continuous, ongoing kind of conversation. Just one more, and then we'll crack on. Yep.
Yeah, just building on that and the comments by the previous gentleman, I think it's very much a matter of open dialogue and honest dialogue, and encompassing, not just the negative sides that perhaps a project or a mine might have to it, but all the positive sides and the knock-on impacts. So you can have a conversation that's holistic and in the round, and everyone's voices can be heard, and then move forward on the basis of all those facts, rather than just looking at one particular negative element of a project.
Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So thank you. Unless there are any other burning things people would like to add, I have one person catching fire in the back corner. Just right in the back.
Thanks. Ian Pickard from Strategy Worldwide. It's absolutely dissuading and persuading, but I think it needs to go beyond that to secure your license to operate in the broadest sense. It's got to be, and where it works well, it's a genuine shared prosperity model where communities can see that this mine is going to benefit them, and they can see how it's going to benefit them. I think that then you then get into the whole area of how do the revenues from the mine come back to that community, and what role do they have in ensuring the money is being spent on things that they value. And that means a two-way street. It can't be a dependency culture. It's got to be a shared endeavour. And there are mechanisms you can do to achieve that. But where it works, that's the sort of model that we see is most effective.
That's brilliant, thank you. So what we've heard put into the room already is this sense that perhaps we need to think again about the phrase social license, because as a sector it's worked really well for us thinking about licensing, because we interact with society in the outside, past the gate world, often through a regulated licensing, or clearly sort of transactional framework. But the picture that you've painted in the room is of a much more interactive, iterative, engagement-based, ongoing process. So perhaps we need to think about social license not as something that is secured until the time comes for it to be reviewed, but something that is much broader. And I'll come back to that kind of concept at the end. So thank you for framing the discussion. What I hope to do in the next 15 minutes or so is paint a picture of where we at the ICMM see we are as a sector on this topic of social license, and to frame some of the key drivers and trends influencing the level of trust that the sector as a whole experiences, and how that both impacts and is influenced by right to mine or social license at specific sites or in specific jurisdictions. To reflect on some of the distrust in our industry, and steps that we are taking or we could consider taking to overcome what is a marked lack of trust in many jurisdictions and increasingly at a global level, and strengthen our license to operate. So just a very brief start. Does everyone know who the ICMM is, what we do? We're the International Council on Mining and Metals. We're an international organisation dedicated to safe, fair and sustainable mining. We bring together 26 of the world's leading, but not always largest, mining companies and 36 regional and commodity mining associations to work on continuous improvement in mining's contribution to sustainable development. So our members employ over 1 million people. We produce roughly half of the world's copper and iron ore, and almost a third of all mined commodities. And our members operate in over 50 countries. Every member commits to the Sustainable Development Framework, which includes 10 principles and 8 position statements on specific issues, and works to deliver continuous improvement. So we have well over 30 different working groups focused on specific topics, from mine closure and human rights through to responsible sourcing. So where are we as a sector? How do we think about social license? So first of all, we know it's a priority. Survey after survey of leaders across the sector have seen social license move up into the top of the risk register in the last 10 years. So reporting on the top 10 business risks facing mining and metals in the last 2 years, just as one example, Ernst & Young identified social license to operate as the highest priority from its interviews with CEOs and other industry leaders. But we also know that mining can be a powerful driver of economic development, and you very much reflected that. So, for example, ICMM members alone paid over $100 billion in taxes and royalties over the past 5 years. $100 billion. They directly employ over 1 million people, as I've said, but there's a job multiplier from our members' operations in developed countries of between 3 and 5, and up to 25 in developing countries. They procure locally to the tune of $17 billion in 2016, and they spend more than $1 billion in social projects annually. So this contribution is particularly significant for poorer countries that are dependent on mining, where it's key to them diversifying and achieving their development goals. And just to reflect on that, in fact, in the last year, ICMM published a piece of research that found that the lives of people in countries where economies are dependent on mining have, on average, improved faster than those people in other countries over the last 20 years. So we took the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals and we said, there is this strong narrative around the resource curse, around the challenges that minerals and extractive dependent countries, particularly mining countries, face. What does that actually mean in terms of life outcomes and opportunities for individuals? And what we found is that in the 25 countries that are mining dependent, the people of those countries over the last 20 years, at the end of those 20 years, are healthier, generally, they're better educated, they enjoy improved access to affordable and clean energy, water and sanitation, as well as telecoms and financial services. So the report shows that these people are better off in absolute terms, and that they outperformed countries that are not resource dependent. So of course, you can't attribute causality between the prevalence of mining alone and the observed social progress. There are lots of other factors at play, including government capacity and policies, the quality of governance, economic activity in other sectors, and how effective social programs are. But the research clearly shows that mining can be a powerful enabler of sustainable development. It creates jobs, as we've heard, it provides revenues, it lifts people out of poverty. In short, it can transform natural capital into human opportunity. But when I speak with stakeholders around the world, whether they're NGOs advocating for greater community benefit or changes in our governance practices, whether it's mining executives, investors, governments, or even some of the reflections we heard in the room this morning, it can feel like engaging in parallel universes. From site to corporate leadership, I often hear frustration that all the benefits they feel mining is generating aren't recognized, that they're not appreciated, and that the ask from countries and communities just keeps growing, as well as from investors. So a challenge for more transparency and metrics. And then from the other side, frustration from communities with what is often described as a lack of engagement. So they don't involve us in decisions that affect our lives. They say they know what's best for us. They don't talk to us. They don't listen. Now, there's frustration with undelivered promises, frustration with what they perceive as unevenly shared benefits. So it's not just who do you listen to, it's who gets the job, who gets the education program, who gets the road. And from practitioners in the field, many of whom we work with within ICMM, but also more broadly, from social performance practitioners, from the consultants many of you will employ, perhaps some in the room, who help our members navigate resettlement processes, impact assessments, a consultation on benefits delivery. What we're beginning to hear are warnings that our stated ambition as an industry around the importance of securing social license and benefiting communities is not being matched by investment, executive attention, the integration of business, integration of management processes into broader business practice, and that it's not receiving the investment and the innovation that's required. So if you're interested, there's a recent and excellent piece of research from Deanna Kemp and her team at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining from the University of Queensland, which paints really quite a comprehensive picture of the current state of social performance across the sector. So what I'd like to do is just share some reflections on what might be done to begin to narrow the gap between expectation and performance. But firstly, why should we care? And the focus here is on the future of mining. We know that leaders in the sector have identified social license as a top risk, but there are at least 3 or 4 global trends that point to the need for concerted action to build trust in the sector. So the first is growing community opposition to mining. So whether it's Lock the Gate in Australia, a rise in community protests and incidents, or the passing of regulation to ban or severely restrict mining in certain jurisdictions. And these challenges are being compounded by the new technologies, some of which you've heard about this morning, and you'll hear over the next 2 days. So whether it's automated trucks or digitization, the social contract with communities has always been based on you will get the environmental impacts, and there are negative social impacts, but you're the first in line for jobs. And in a world in which there are perhaps 30 to 70% less jobs in certain brackets at site, what does that mean for the social contract? So we need to get better at this fast in order to be able to adopt technology to deliver the efficiency gains and in many ways meet the sustainable development objectives of low carbon emissions and to have access to the minerals and metals, to your point, that we need for the new economy. Second, increasing calls for transparency and accountability along the value chain. Consumer-facing brands are exerting pressure on their own supply chains to raise ESG standards. When ICMM was founded in 2003, it would have been hard to imagine that Apple would one day be a bigger driver for ESG improvements than Greenpeace, or that investors would demand more accurate data on social impact than Oxfam. But that's what we've seen in the last couple of years. Third, events earlier this year in Brazil with the tragic failure of the tailings storage facility at Brumadinho have dramatically undermined trust in the sector. Stakeholders tell us that this is an existential moment for the industry. Coming just 3 years after Samarco, there's a sense that we haven't put our house in order and that we need to act and act fast. So the bar to demonstrate greater transparency and accountability is set higher. The sector needs to meet it. And ICMM is very pleased to be co-convening with the United Nations Environment Programme and the Principles for Responsible Investment, an independent review to establish an international standard on tailings storage facility. So fourth, our efforts to try and understand and respond to these trends is set against a backdrop where global and national governance systems are under strain, and you don't need to look any further than down the road to see how that's playing out, even in some of the very stable jurisdictions. So more than ever, mining needs to be able to know and show the extent of its social and environmental impacts and get smarter and more deliberative about securing and maintaining its social license. So how do we do this? So as a whole, we need to rethink what the social contract means for the decades ahead. It needs to include, we think, at least the following elements. So doing good, not just doing well. Active participation in development. Multi-stakeholder partnerships will be critical. An active approach to climate change and more involvement in protecting human rights. But what does this look like in practice? So at ICMM, we're quite focused on looking to deliver a step change in social performance across the sector. So what we mean by social performance is both the management approach, think environmental management, so the systems and processes you have in place, but also the outcomes of that. So we've aligned around 3 focus areas in our current 3-year strategy, which began in January, and in each of them there's a focus on strengthening social license across the sector. So first, in inspiring and enabling leadership. In November last year, we announced the introduction of a set of performance expectations. So these aim to set a benchmark for the industry's social and environmental performance. There are 38 of them. ICMM members will commit to comply with them. 32 of them apply at site. We're designing the systems that non-members can also participate. What will this initiative do? Our expectation is that it will be the most far-reaching verification approach for the environmental and social performance of the mining industry ever. So for the first time, it requires validation at site as well as at the corporate level. For ICMM, it will apply to 650 member assets in over 50 countries and will begin to provide the assurance that customers and end users want that production has been sourced responsibly for minerals and metals. Embedded in this performance expectations are requirements on labour rights, resettlement, local content, gender, access to grievance mechanisms, mine closure, so many requirements around social performance to really set a floor for what responsible mining systems and processes look like at site. The second strategic area for ICMM is around innovating for the future, driving a step change in the way we design, build, and operate mines. And here we've been working over the last 2 years to develop an aspirational social goal, a program of work that the industry as a whole can collaborate on to deliver a step change around skills development. Now, this will be over an 8 to 15-year period, and it was initially envisaged as a response to automation. So as I was saying, the social contract with communities shifts, less jobs, possibly same or slightly less environmental impacts. What does that mean for mining companies? And there's some groundbreaking work that's being done by the Intergovernmental Forum on Mines, Metals, Minerals and Sustainable Development to try and understand what the policy response for governments should be. Should they raise revenues? Should they slow down the adoption of technology? Should they facilitate and support it? And what we are interested in putting together is an industry response that will help maximize the positive socioeconomic benefits from skills acquisition, but help position the industry to secure the talent it needs to deliver and implement the technology of the future, but also continue to provide the benefits that communities want. And the third strategic focus area is on strengthening operational practices. We have a range of guidance, and over the last year, we've been undertaking a benchmark and landscape work to understand the business case for social license. So your reflections this morning will go into that work, so thank you. And to really identify opportunities for the sector to come together and work on potentially new measurement standards, new guidance on what requirements might look like at particular stages of the mine life cycle to secure social license. Thinking about the skills and competencies the people at site need. If you're a GM, what do you need to understand? What management tools do you need? What dashboards can you refer to ensure that your social license at site is being secured and maintained over time? So in conclusion, I'd say that the mining sector has come a very long way in a relatively short space of time, both in understanding our social impacts, in developing and embedding social management systems and responding to societal expectations. But the bar is getting higher, both in response to recent events in Brazil and a range of global drivers. To respond, we have to strengthen our social license to operate. To do that, the sector needs to deliver a step change in our social management approach, to be better able to know and show we have identified and taken steps to mitigate our negative social impacts, and we've delivered socioeconomic benefit. So in the last couple of minutes, I'd be really interested to take any questions or to hear your reflections on some of that content. Thank you.